Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course is open for enrollment once again, and as I do every year, I've decided to make a video about it because I took that course in 2015. It was pivotal in my career as a self-published author, and it could be pivotal in your career as well, or maybe not. I don't know. That's what the video is about, because every single year the industry changes, the course changes, and this year in particular there are lots of controversies surrounding Mark Dawson. So is Ads for Authors right for you? Stay tuned and we will figure it out. Hi guys, it's me, and if you don't know who me is, my name is Roland Hume, and I am an author. I want to be an author ever since I was 9 years old. My mum was a writer, but I never got anywhere with the traditional publishing industry. And brief message for the traditional publishing industry. Yeah, tons of rejection slips from them. But when Amazon launched the Amazon Kindle, I started publishing short stories on there, and people started buying them. And then I started writing full-length novels, and people started buying them. And I ended up being able to build quite a successful career for myself as a self-published author. I've sold over 69,000 copies of my books. I've reached 320,000 readers on Kindle Unlimited, and I've made over $300,000 in royalties. So yeah, I am where a lot of self-published authors would like to be. I'm not where I want to be, but that's because I'm always looking forward. I want to make myself bigger and better in the years to come. But you know what? I've got a lot of experience and a lot of success that hopefully colors what I can say about one of the things that was pivotal in helping my career be successful. And that is a course I took in 2015 by a man called Mark Dawson. Mark Dawson is a very successful self-published author, one of the first really pioneering successful self-published authors. He's written a number of series of books, but he's most famous for a series of books about a character called John Milton, who John Milton is basically, if you imagine Jack Reacher and James Bond had a baby, that's an interesting thought, it would be John Milton. He's a British Secret Service agent who kind of goes rogue and then lives the Ronin lifestyle, kind of like Jack Reacher does. And Mark Dawson has sold over 5 million copies of his books, his self-published books. I mean, he's built an incredible career based off self-publishing these books. And the thing is, I would like to say I've read Mark Dawson's books, and I prefer Lee Child, not going to lie. So I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons for Mark Dawson's success isn't necessarily the quality of his writing, which is fine. It's like he writes very, very serviceable books, but it's because of the fact that he figured out how to advertise and market his books successfully. And he did that before anybody else did. Remember, self-publishing, I mean, these days it's still in its infancy, but back then it was the Wild West. And you could publish a book and you could go viral and you could be prodigiously successful. And Mark Dawson figured out, hey, I'll advertise these books. And that's how he ended up being so successful, selling 5 million copies of them. You go and look at The Cleaner, which is the first book in his John Milton series, and it's got like 18,000 reviews. I mean, he was a beast in terms of self-publishing. The interesting thing about Mark Dawson, though, is he's probably known better as the man behind Ads for Authors, which is a course that he put together about how self-published authors can advertise their books. He created this course. There was one course called Self-Publishing 101. It's split into two courses now. There's Self-Publishing Launchpad about how to publish books, and then there's Ads for Authors. He was really the first person to create a course about how to successfully market and advertise your books. And I remember investing in that course in 2015 and it changing the trajectory of my writing career completely. So I started self-publishing in 2013 and I was really happy because people would buy my books, and I was looking at all the traditional publishers and being like, hey, oh, look, there's my cat making a guest appearance. But I wasn't where I wanted to be, especially when I started writing full-length novels. And then I took Mark Dawson's course. I took it in 2015, and there were certain key elements, like building a subscriber list, for example, that ended up making all the difference. And it took a few years. It wasn't until 2018 that I wrote my first bestseller. But when I did, I used Mark Dawson's teachings to market it, and it exploded. And since then, as I said, I've sold 69,000 copies of my books. I've been very successful. And I would not have been so successful, or at least not as quickly, if it wasn't for Mark Dawson's course. So I'm a big fan of that course. And the reason I make these videos is because I'm a big fan of this course. And also, I'm not doing it out of the goodness of my heart. If you watch this video and you think that Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course sounds like something you might get some value from, there's a link down below in that description. If you click on that link and you buy the course, I get a little piece of the action. And that's why I make videos like this. But I like to make videos like this as honestly and transparently as I can. I don't want to just sit here and talk about Mark Dawson's courses and say, oh, they're wonderful, they're great. I really want these videos to be something that people find valuable. And at the end of this, hopefully you'll be like, I'm not ready to invest yet, or I am definitely ready. Like, I don't want anyone to invest the money in Mark Dawson's course and not feel like they got their money's worth. And that's something that a lot of people have questions about these days. Because when I took Mark Dawson's course back in 2015, he was pretty much the only person launching a course like this. And these days, it's a very different set of circumstances. In fact, I would say when it comes to Mark Dawson and when it comes to Ads for Authors, the first question and hesitation a lot of people have these days is everybody and their cat is selling a course about how to be a successful self-published author. Not going to lie, I made a course about how to be a successful self-published author. It was called, Hey, you've self-published a book on Amazon, now what? And the problem is, a lot of these people creating these courses are doing so because they weren't successful as a self-published author, and therefore they pivoted to exploit the audience of aspiring authors and try and sell a course on how to be a successful self-published author. And there is that disparity. They don't have the receipts. So I worked with one author, I was invited to their podcast, and they're talking about how many books they'd sold. And I was like, hang on a second, mate, I've sold more books than you. Why are you selling a course? And I think it is a real issue, a real thing. I think aspiring authors really want to be successful. They are an audience willing to spend money on that, and people are exploiting them. I've never thought that Mark Dawson was among those people, though. He was the first person to ever really come up with these courses. Everyone else is following his footsteps and being derivative. But also, he has always had the receipts to back it up. So you go to Mark Dawson's books on amazon.co.uk and you'll see, even though like the cleaner has been out for donkey's years, it's still 1800 in the rank. So it's still making quite a bit of money because Mark Dawson is advertising it effectively. And all of his other books are like sub 10,000 in the ranks. And yeah, he is still selling bucket loads of books. So he wasn't one of these people who like pivoted away from publishing and tried to exploit self-published authors instead. You know, if you can't do, teach. He instead continues to do, but also continues to teach. And his course gets updated every year to reflect how the industry has changed. And the industry has changed massively. I will admit that back in the days when Mark Dawson became successful, and even when I was successful, it was kind of the Wild West on Amazon. And if you wrote a book that had a really sticky hook, it could go viral and you could be massively successful without necessarily advertising it that much. And these days, that is not the case. If you go to any product page on Amazon, 70% of that page is filled with ads that authors have paid for. So if you aren't paying money to advertise your book is pretty much invisible on Amazon at the moment. And that's really why courses like Ads for Authors, it's gone from being a nice to have to being a have to have. You can, I mean, anybody can have a career as a successful self-published author, but you have to learn the craft of writing and you have to follow the process of successful self-publishing, which incorporates advertising. If you are not advertising your books, you are probably not going to be successful as a self-published author. And so, yeah, learning how to do that is very, very important. And is Mark Dawson's course the right place to learn to do that? Well, every single year it gets updated, and every single year, because you buy lifetime access. I bought access in 2015 and I can still go in now in 2024 and actually look at all of the course materials even as they get updated. So I'm looking at brand new course materials even though I joined all that time ago, and the business has changed. I mean, when I started out, you advertised on Facebook and that was it. And now you can advertise on Facebook or Instagram or BookBub or Twitter or TikTok. I mean, yeah, the opportunities for authors are far more wide ranging, but also the competition is tougher, and it's not an easy industry to break into anymore. That's not saying you can't break into it, and we'll talk about that in terms of how I've been successful, but it is a very different industry to be in. Which brings us on to Mark Dawson as a person. A lot of people look at Mark Dawson, and for years, everybody loved him. They were like, Mark Dawson, he's the guy who helps self-published authors be successful. But there's something perverse about the British character, about how, we love people being successful. We love a good success story up to a certain point. But once you go beyond that, the British have this defect in the character where, the tallest nail has to get hammered down. And anybody who gets a bit too big for their breeches, suddenly everyone is targeting them. And in the last couple of years, Mark Dawson has gone from like this champion of the self-published author to kind of a pariah based on some controversies that have arisen around him. And before I recommend Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course, I thought it was worth actually talking about those controversies, because I don't see that many people talking about them. And if they do talk about them, they generally come in with an axe to grind. Like I said, there's this defect in the British character that a nail that stands too high has to get hammered down. Certain people just have it in for Mark Dawson now, and they just love any excuse to go after him, like a dog after a rabbit. And I think that's worth talking about as well. So the big issue with Mark, well, out of it all, I think there are kind of like three big issues people have Mark Dawson, and that goes on to whether or not they think Ads for Authors is worth it. And the first is what I mentioned earlier, this whole idea of, hey, if you're so successful as a self-published author, why are you making a course about it instead of focusing on just selling your books? And that is a big red flag for a lot of people who are selling courses, and myself included. I think the course that I put together, so you've self-published a book on Amazon, now what, has a lot of valuable information in it, but I think me creating it and trying to sell it, I should have been focused on selling and marketing my own books, and that's what I am focused on these days. The course is still out there, and I'll talk about it a little later, but yeah, I think a lot of people selling courses these days should be focused on selling books. But Mark Dawson is different, because Mark Dawson continues to sell bucket loads of books. And what Ads for Authors and Self-Publishing 101 eventually became is something much bigger. Like, it's a huge community of writers. There's a massive Facebook group. Every year in London, they have a huge get-together. And Mark Dawson himself, he's gone from a massively successful self-published author to a guy whose book was featured in the Richard and Judy book club. Oh, you Americans, you're probably like, who the hell are Richard and Judy? Honestly, Google them. It's a trip. But you imagine the Oprah Book Club. Yeah, we have that in the UK, and it's the Richard and Judy Book Club. And to have a self-published author have his book featured in the Richard and Judy Book Club alongside like Anthony Horowitz's latest James Bond book, like, that's a big deal. The other thing with Mark Dawson is that he's become a top 10 Sunday Times bestseller, which is something that is very, very unprecedented for a self-published author. Which brings us on to the second controversy surrounding him, which is a few years ago when Mark Dawson achieved this incredible thing. Self-published author, become a number 8 bestseller in the Sunday Times chart. That's wild. But after that happened, the book sales monitor, Nielsen Bookscan, thought something a bit fishy about this and started investigating Mark Dawson, and found out that the same week that Mark Dawson achieved the number 8 spot in the Sunday Times bestseller list, he had bought 400 hardback copies of his own book from a children's bookstore in Salisbury, where he lives. And a lot of people were like, oh, well, the only reason he got into the top 10 rankings of the Sunday Times bestseller list is because he bought 400 copies of his own books. And you know what? They are absolutely 100% right. That's how it works. Most of the newspaper bestseller lists, like the New York Times bestseller list, they require you to have a certain number of book sales in a single week's period from a variety of book retailers to get onto that position. And Mark Dawson was so close, and then he pushed himself over the edge by buying 400 copies of his own books. And a lot of people thought that sounded like cheating. And then the traditional publishing industry, a lot of voices in there were like, look, he cheated. And I think, okay, there's something to be said for that. Although Mark Dawson explained that he bought 400 hardback copies of his books because he knew that would nudge him over the finish line, and he planned to sell those as signed editions to the American market, because the American marketplace, the book sales there wouldn't count in the Sunday Times bestseller charts because they're based in the UK. So, he gamed the system a bit. And I think it's fair enough to say, oh, that sounds a bit like cheating. But I would like to say that it's not actually cheating. Not because I don't think it should be classified as cheating, but because the traditional book publishing industry does it all the bloody time. All the bloody time. That's what I really hated about all of the people from traditional publishing. Were like, oh, he cheated. It's like, you do it all the time. All the time. Donald Trump Jr., yeah, his first book, Triggered, was a New York Times ~1 bestseller. And do you know why? It's because the week it was released, the Republican National Committee spent $94,800 buying 3,160 copies of the book. So 3/4 of the sales of that book that you needed to become a New York Times bestseller were all basically the little Trump lobby buying copies of his own books. It was a bought and paid for transaction. And so, you know, if a massive publisher, traditional publisher, publishes that book, and then, you know, Trump's people buy copies of their own book, and no one has a big deal about it, and it becomes a New York Times bestseller, why does anybody care if Mark Dawson does it? The only reason people care about Mark Dawson doing it is because they have it in for Mark Dawson. And they're like, oh, we'll ignore traditional publishing doing this all the time because we want to go after Mark Dawson. And the traditional publishers are like, yeah, sick 'em boys, because they don't like a self-published author getting too big for his britches. As I said, tallest nail always gets hammered down. So in terms of that, I don't think I would feel very comfortable if I was in that position buying 400 copies of my own books. But at the same time, I can understand why Mark Dawson did it, and I can also say that I have absolutely zero issue with it because traditional publishers do it all the time. If you have an issue with Mark Dawson buying those 400 copies of the books, then boy, let me tell you, you're in for a rough ride if you start looking into how traditional publishers work. Boom. That's the second controversy. Does this impact how successful Ads for Authors is? It's like, yeah, how do you think he got that close? I mean, Donald Trump Jr., they had to buy 3,000 copies of his books, which, as I said, it's like 75% of the target that you need to actually get into the rankings there. Mark Dawson bought 400. That's all he needed to like nudge him over the edge. So very different degrees of corruption there. And whether you agree with it or not, I mean, that is an industry standard practice. And I wouldn't do it myself, but I'm also not going to lambast somebody for it. Which brings me onto the slightly dodgier and more controversial thing that people are saying about Mark Dawson. This is more recent. I think I've said this already today in this video. Hopefully I'm not rambling or repeating myself. But Mark Dawson has reached a certain stage in his career where some people just want to drag him down a peg or two. That, yeah, as I said, that defect in the British character, we have to hammer the tallest nail down. And I think some people have gone into the Dawson bashing in poor faith. And one of them is this person who launched a Reddit thread last year saying, is Mark Dawson a serial plagiarist? And they provided 2 pages of examples of where they thought Mark Dawson was plagiarizing other writers, including, stay there for 1 second, this writer here, William Boyd. William Boyd, who wrote a James Bond continuation novel and a James Bond continuation short story. So I find that quite interesting because, you know, it's fun when an author gets accused of plagiarism and you have the book that they supposedly plagiarized in your bookshelf. So, yeah, this bloke on Reddit said, yeah, Mark Dawson is a serial plagiarist, and he provided examples. So there was an article, well, it was a short story by William Boyd, who wrote this book solo, called William Boyd Interviews James Bond, and it was published in The Guardian. And this bloke on Reddit was like, listen, Mark Dawson's ripped William Boyd off, and he used some examples. In the 2013 William Boyd Interviews James Bond story in The Guardian, William Boyd uses the phrase, the gaudy harlequinade of youth, much in evidence. And in 2014's The Driver by Mark Dawson, which is a John Milton book, I think, he uses the phrase, the harlequinade of youth, much in evidence. So, yeah, there are like 8 words that verbatim are exactly the same. Worth noting. In the same short story, William Boyd has this passage here. The dark-eyed girls in their short dresses and the long-haired young men in crushed velvet and fur-trimmed Afghans. And in that same book, 2014's The Driver by Mark Dawson, he uses the phrase long haired young men in vintage suits and fur trimmed Afghans and girls in short dresses. They are very similar sentences. A couple of words are different. There's another example here in a 2012 article by John Litchfield for The Independent about the Annecy shootings. He writes, "The misty slopes of the massif of the Montagne de Charbon tower above the skyline." And in the first John Milton book, The Cleaner by Mark Dawson, which was published a year later, Dawson writes, "The misty slopes of the Massif de Montagne Charbon stretched above the tree line." And it's like they're close. They're very close. One tower above the tree line and one stretched above the tree line. He continues to give examples here, but I'm not going to lie to you. As you go through these pages of examples, and there are only 2 pages, this guy who wrote the Reddit thread, he's like, I'm going to go through and provide tons of evidence. And he kind of disappeared off into nowhere. But he continued to give examples, and they became less and less convincing the more you read through them. One of them was, in 2013, Mark Dawson wrote a book called Saint Death, which is where John Milton goes to Mexico to, talk about the border wars. And he uses the phrase, Milton passed the iron girder skeleton of a building. And in a book published in 2010, A Mexico, War Along the Border by Ed Villamy, he used the phrase, we passed the iron girder skeleton of a building that never seems to get finished. And I'm not going to lie, iron girder skeleton of a building is, those are the words that Dawson apparently plagiarized. And I'm like, it's a bit of a stretch. I mean, I can get it. I think it's very clear that, when Mark Dawson was writing a book about John Milton in Mexico, he would read other books about the Mexican border crisis, and maybe he lifted particular phrases from it, words of phrases, and I can understand that. But that's very different from, like, who was the president of Harvard who recently got sacked because they were, like, plagiarizing massive passages, copying and pasting a passage of a book and inserting it in as your own. That's plagiarism. To me, using turns of phrase that are very similar, that's more of a grey area. I just wrote a really long article based on a video I saw by a guy called Tom Scar about the Somerton scale, which is the Somerton scale of plagiarism. And that goes all the way from something that is completely unrelated to something that is a blatant, like, direct copy of something. And there are shades of grey in between. And as a writer, Picasso said, good artists borrow, great artists steal. Very little is completely created in a vacuum these days. And Mark Dawson publishes, kind of mainstream genre thrillers, and they are very derivative. I don't mean that in a negative way, but they are very derivative of, like, James Bond and the Lee Child, Jack Reacher books. And that's kind of the thing. He writes books targeted towards people who like those books. And that means sometimes the odd turns of phrase might get copied over. And ideally, you wouldn't want that unless you do want that. And what I mean by that is, how many times a day do you say a turn of phrase, use a turn of phrase or something that you plagiarized from Shakespeare? You didn't plagiarize it from Shakespeare, because they're just turns of phrase, like all's well that ends well, that have become so ingrained in the lexicon of the English language that you use them without even thinking that at some point it was Shakespeare who coined that turn of phrase. And I think you get a certain amount of grace in a book when you maybe use the same turns of phrase, the same few words put together as an author who went before. Because sometimes you do it unintentionally, and sometimes you do it less than unintentionally. And I will say, I'm guilty of that. There's a particular phrase that struck out to me in a James Bond book, the black eye of the automatic followed them across the room. Something like that. And I probably use that phrase in every single one of my books. At some point, someone gets a gun pointed at them, and, like, the black eye of the gun stared them down, or something like that. And I will admit, I stole that turn of phrase from Ian Fleming. I'll also admit that I've used it so often that I can't even remember what the original turn of phrase is, and mine's just based on it, because I like the idea of it, the metaphor of it, of, like, a black unblinking eye staring at you. Because that's what a gun, when you have a gun pointed at you, it's like it's staring at you. I like that, so I kind of borrowed it. And I don't consider it like stealing something, it's more an Easter egg or a homage to something. there's one book I wrote called Branded by the Modern Day Pirate. And first of all, that book is set in the modern day off the coast of Somalia and Kenya, but it is Conan the Barbarian, basically. The story is Conan the Barbarian. It just happens to have modern day pirates and be set off the coast of Africa instead of the kingdom of Atlantis. But there's one phrase at the end where the evil bad guy, who was a Greek guy, Greek shipping magnate called Rastapopoulos, which is a name I borrowed from a Tintin book, just want to say, says to the plucky hero who's finally going to get his revenge, I am the wellspring. No, I am the wellspring from which you flow. That's it. I am the wellspring from which you flow. And that is a line from Conan the Barbarian that I stole. I just took it and put it in my book. And I put it in my book as an Easter egg. I didn't steal it because I wanted to pass it off as my own. I took that because, to me, I wrote this book, and this book was Conan the Barbarian, except set in the modern day with pirates. But the whole tale of revenge and getting to the point where you are face to face with a man you've spent your life trying to revenge yourself against, and he says, you would not have a life if I hadn't given you this reason to live. I am the wellspring from which you flow. It was in there because it was a direct tribute to that. And I had readers write in and say, like, oh my God, I read that line and I was like, I got it. This is Conan the Barbarian. And I felt so good because it was an Easter egg. I wasn't stealing anything. It was an Easter egg. And to be honest, like, so much of life and so much of literature and so much of all modern creativity comes from that. I wrote a book called Codename Mistletoe, which is basically Die Hard as a romance novel. And it's not. If you read it, you know, the idea of a skyscraper getting taken over by terrorists, that's really all it has in common with Die Hard, except it has that in common with Die Hard because it's a tribute, a homage to Die Hard, just written in the style of a romance novel. I think everything that gets created has things that it takes from things that have gone before. And part of that, as somebody who enjoys these things, is the pleasure of seeing these Easter eggs. I read Testament by Testament by Kim Sherwood. Sorry, I lost my brain then. Where she mentions a couple of James Bondy things there as a testament to James Bond fandom. So you read that wonderful book about two brothers during the Holocaust, and it makes water come out of your eyes. But also you read it and you see the references to James Bond, and you're like, oh, Kim's one of us. And a lot of other books. I've read Alexandra Fuller wrote a wonderful book about her growing up in Rhodesia with her parents, and her father died reading a James Bond book, and it's like, oh yeah, she gets it. She's one of me. You put these Easter eggs in because as an author, you're speaking to your people out there. Jack Carr, who writes the James Reese books, you know, the Terminal List and stuff. In every single one of his books, he has references to Magnum PI, and yeah, he's not stealing these things. They're an Easter egg. And so, yeah, is Mark Dawson including these as deliberate Easter eggs? No, but I think he's banging out stories that are kind of following the footsteps of stories that have come before, and maybe he got a bit fast and loose with the turns of phrase that he takes. But I really don't think there's much controversy there, and I think the fact that no one followed up with it and produced more examples, you know, this is different. When you have like, what's Donald Trump's wife, Melinda Trump or whatever, when she gives a speech and it's copied word for word from Michelle Obama's speech, that's plagiarism. When you have a genre author writing an adventure story that uses a couple of turns of phrases that are very similar to turns of phrases that have come before, that's a different kettle of fish. Because you know what? You read these books, you just want to be entertained. It's like if you watch Law and Order SVU or something, so much of that stuff is just derivative from other shows and real life news stories and stuff like that. You don't complain about it because that's what you're there for. And I really fail to get like passionately outraged about the fact that Mark Dawson did that. Again, like with the buying the books, I don't think it's something necessarily that I would have wanted to do. But looking at my own work, I can say like there are some patches where, you know, I used to turn a phrase that I probably gleaned from another writer, but that's what all writers have done through the history of time. I'm not saying that it's okay, but I'm also not saying that it's something that should be utterly condemned. And yeah, really, when I found out that Mark Dawson had been accused of plagiarizing the words of of William Boyd, that actually made me like him more. Because they always say if you're in a bar and there's a girl reading a book and you go up and you see the book and the book is a book that you recognize and like, it's like the book recommends the person rather than the person recommending the book. And the fact that Mark Dawson plagiarized William Boyd, a James Bond author, makes me more likely to like Mark Dawson, because I'm like, this guy gets what I'm into. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on it. So a lot of controversy going on with Mark Dawson. But I think at the end of the day, nobody who's started these controversies or jumped on them does so in good faith. I think Mark Dawson has reached a certain stage of notoriety, a certain stage of like public awareness where people decide, oh, I like him because I followed him for a while and he's given me a lot of value and helped me in my career, or I don't like him because he's a self-published author. He's up his own arse. What's he doing getting on the Richard and Judy book show? I'm a self-published author. Why aren't I as successful as that? It's all insecurity and like pettiness, and there's that defect of the British character where you have to hammer the tallest nail down. I think anybody who's gone into these attacks against Mark Dawson does so in poor faith. And I think at the end of the day, look, Mark Dawson is a businessman. There is a stage as a self-published author where you have to be like, am I doing this to write the books that I want to write, or am I doing this to make a living doing it? And hopefully you can find the beautiful sweet spot between those two. But at some point, you're going to have to make decisions based on the commercial viability of your books rather than, your own particular whims and idioms. Which brings me on to Ads for Authors. Ads for Authors is a course that Mark Dawson put together, and it is a course that you should take only if you are truly invested in becoming commercially successful as a self-published author. There are lots of self-published authors who just want to write a book. And obviously everyone wants their books to be a massive success and to be a bestseller and for tons of people to read them. But how badly do you really want that? How badly do you really want that? For me, my goal as a self-published author is I want to be able to support myself and my family very comfortably doing nothing but writing and self-publishing books. That's my goal. And therefore, I look at it as a business. And I fortunately have 25 years of experience in advertising and marketing to help back me up. But I brought Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course because I wanted a template of how to advertise my books, because I knew I wrote good books. I knew I could come up with good advertising concepts. I just needed to know how to do it. And Ads for Authors taught me how to do it. And if you are a self-published author and you want your books to be successful, you have to think very seriously about this as a business. And like a business, you have to invest in things. If you want to start a food truck selling tacos, you have to buy a food truck. And if you want to become successful advertising your self-published books, you have to buy the materials to be able to learn how to do that. And then you need to take what you learn and then you need to invest money in actually running advertising to make that happen. And it's not easy. When you start advertising, it's difficult to make money. Let me grab my piece of paper again. I've been very lucky and been very successful self-publishing, but the longer it goes on, the trickier it gets. And especially this time of year, you can always tell when Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course opens up, because immediately you go to Facebook and you will be deluged with tons of adverts for self-published books. And they're normally terrible because people follow Mark Dawson's advice, but they don't necessarily understand what self-publishing is. I find I go on there and there are tons of authors who just copied and paste huge sections of dialogue, and then they take a picture that they AI generated that looks really weird, and then they put it into the flow, and I'm seeing it and I'm like, I'm not really interested in this genre of books. I'm not going to read this huge wall of text that you've got. That AI image looks really dodgy, so I'm just going to like flow through it. You can see that there are a lot of people who take what Mark Dawson teaches them, but don't put much thought or effort or commercial investment into it. Whereas if you want to be successful as an author, you can, and you have the opportunity to do that. And Ads for Authors gives you the tools to do that, but you really, really need to have a book that people want to buy. And when you do the adverts, you really need to think of it critically through the lens of an advertiser. Like, I look at the whole journey from seeing the ad to clicking on it, to where they land on the product page, to reading the look inside, to reading the blurb, looking the reviews. Every single thing is a step closer to somebody clicking that buy now button, but you have to think of it like that, step by step going through. Is my advert going to be something that people want to click on? When they click on my advert, are they going to want to read the blurb? And once they read the blurb, are they going to want to look at the look inside? And once they read the look inside, are they going to want to look at the reviews? Any of these steps that they have to take, are any of them going to be things that are going to trip somebody up? And hopefully what you do is you put together a campaign reaching out to people that can walk people through to click buy now in enough frequency that you actually turn a profit when you advertise your books. And that is tough. That is really tough to do. I looked over my advertising figures from last year, and I ended up making 188% profit on my advertising, which means basically for every dollar that I spent on advertising, I got that dollar back, and I got 88 cents profit back, which, you know, that's great return on investment. But when you think about it, that is also, you know, a business like return on investment. I mean, that sounds like a great investment, but if you want to make $10,000 a month advertising, if you want to make $8,000 a month from your books, a pure profit, that means you need to spend $10,000 a month advertising the books. So you can see, if you are serious about being a successful self-published author and you're serious about making a living doing it, you can do so. But you have to understand, you will have to work really hard at making sure your books are polished enough that people want to buy them in sufficient quantities that it pays for your advertising. And then you have to understand that the margins that you're talking about aren't going to be life-changing. You're not going to advertise your book and you spend $1 advertising your book and get $5 in book sales. You're not going to have that kind of return. You're going to have a very solid, very respectable return if you're lucky. But it's probably going to be, like me, 88 cents of profit for every dollar I spend. And that means it's a slow business to build up. And not only is it a slow business to build up, but, you know, there are stakes to deal with there. If you're spending $10,000 a month on advertising to get the $8,000 back in profit, what happens if one of your books screws up and suddenly you've spent $10,000 on advertising, but you haven't got that $8,000 back? Like, you can get tripped up doing it. So be aware of that. I definitely recommend Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course. And I think if you are serious about being a self-published author, it's not a nice to have, it's a need to have. But you need to approach this as a professional. You need to approach this and say, okay, I'm going to invest the tens of hours of course material, of studying the course material. I'm going to invest the hundreds, the thousands of dollars to actually make my advertising profitable, realizing I might spend that money and not see it back for a while. And then once you're doing it, you have to realize that you will have to spend a lot of money to hopefully get a lot of money back. But it's a business. You are buying into a business. And if that fills you with excitement and curiosity and you think you can do it, go and buy Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course. Use that link below so I get a little piece of the action. But if that's not jumping out at you, if you're just in this to get a quick buck, this publishing has never been an industry in which you can get a quick buck. So I would say go and get a Krispy Kreme franchise or whatever. This is for people who are truly passionate about writing books, telling stories, and reaching an audience. Now is probably the best time in human history to be able to do that, but you have to work bloody hard to be successful at it. Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course gives you what you need. But yeah, it is bloody hard work. But anyway, that's my thought on it. Final thing is, you know, Mark Dawson is quite a controversial figure these days. There are people, you know, criticizing him. One thing that I believe is going on is Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course is actually sort of separating from Mark Dawson. James Blatch has been like his Robin to his Batman. He's a very accomplished author himself. He wrote a great trio of books about planes that I really, really enjoy. He is now going to take over Ads for Authors. It's going to become Learn Self-Publishing or something like that. And that's going to like separate itself from Mark Dawson, which I think is quite a positive thing in some ways, because I think Mark Dawson has reached the stage where his notoriety can damage the credibility of Ads for Authors when that course doesn't actually deserve that kind of attack. So, I don't know. Hopefully, what I've outlined here has been interesting. And if you think it is interesting, if you agree with my take on Mark Dawson's plagiarism accusations, or you disagree, let me know down in the comment section below. Don't be shy. Like, just because I think that it's not a big deal doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right. You know, I think a lot of things aren't a big deal. I'm quite a chill, relaxed person actually. But I would love to know your opinion about it. And once again, if you do buy Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course based on what I told you, hopefully you won't be disappointed. But I'll tell you what, if you use that link down below, if you buy the course, I will give you free access to my course that I made called So You Self-Published a Book on Amazon, Now What? Which I think is a pretty good course. It's just, I want to be a successful self-published author, not a guy who designs courses for successful self-published authors. So I'll give that to you away for free, and I hope you enjoy it and I hope you get a lot of value out of it. But yeah, I am here to take the journey with you, rather than lead you on the journey in the same way Mark Dawson does. So that's my thoughts on it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you have, let me know in the comment section down below. And I'll be back with a much shorter video about something much more interesting very soon. Ciao.